Now we're going to build a filter for validating JSON Web Tokens. When a request comes in, we want to check if it includes a valid JSON Web Token. If it does, we trust the user and allow access to protected resources. And if not, we reject the request or treat it as unauthenticated. To implement this, we're going to add a new filter. So we go into Filters package and add a new class, JWT Authentication Filter. Now again, this should extend once per request filter. We annotate it with component and then implement the methods. Now, in this method, first we have to extract the authorization header from the request. So we call request.getHeader, pass authorization. We get the auth header. Then we check if auth header is null or it doesn't start with bearer, then we pass the request to the next filter in the chain. At this point, Spring security will kick in, and if the target resource or the target endpoint is protected, Spring will deny access and return a 403 error. Otherwise, if we have the authorization header, then we have to extract the token and validate it. We're essentially replicating the logic we had in our auth controller. So here we call auth header that replace bearer with an empty string. Then we get the token. Next, we need to validate it. To do that, we have to add our JWT service to this class. So we declare a field, private final JWT service. Next, we add allargs constructor. Now back to where we were. So we get the token. Then we validate it. If it's not valid, we pass the request to the next filter in the chain. Again, to let Spring Security take care of processing this request. And finally, we return. But if we get to this point, that means we have a valid token. So we have to tell Spring that this user is authenticated and allow access to protected resources. To do that, first we have to create an authentication object. So we declare a variable called authentication and set it to a new instance of username, password, authentication token. You have seen this before. We use this when registering users, right? Now, this class has two constructors. One takes a principal and credentials. Principal represents the user. It could be a user object, it could be a user ID, email, whatever we use to represent a user. Credentials is often password. And here we have a third parameter that's authorities, which is for roles and permissions. Now, there is something tricky about this class that you have to know, and that is these two constructors are used for different purposes. We use the first constructor during the login process where we pass a username and password, but the second constructor for representing an authenticated user. In other words, we use the first constructor for unauthenticated or anonymous users and the second constructor for authenticated users. So here we have to pass three arguments: a principal, credentials, and authorities. For principal, we can pass a complete user object or the user's email. If you want to pass a complete user object, we have to fetch it from our database. Now, this is not something I recommend because this filter is going to get executed on every request. So if a client is accessing public resources or public endpoints, like the endpoint for getting products and categories or working with shopping carts, in every request, we are fetching the current user from the database. So that adds an extra load to our database. So instead, we're going to store the email here. But how do we get the email? We have to extract it from the token. So we go to our JWT service class and define a new method for getting the email from the token. So string get email from token. We pass the token. Now in this method, we have to borrow some code from the validate token method. So first we have to parse the token and get the payload. Once we get the payload, we get this claims object, which is a map. From here, we can get the subject or email. But we don't want to duplicate this code in two places. So let's select these few lines. Now on the top, under the refactor menu, let's go to extract method. We extract this logic into a method called getClaims. Down here, you can see a preview of this method. Now we press tab to complete refactoring. Good. So we have a reusable method for extracting the claims or the payload. Now IntelliJ is saying that this variable is unnecessary, so we can make the code more concise. Alt and Enter. Let's inline this variable. Okay, that's better. Now we can reuse this method for extracting the email from the token. So here we call getClaims from this token. Now we have the claims object, and from here we can get the subject. We get the subject and return it. Back to our filter. So as the first argument here, we call JWT service that get email from token and pass the token. Now the second argument is credentials. When representing an authenticated user, we don't need credentials or password, so we pass null. Now the third parameter is authorities, which is about roles and permissions. At this point, we don't want to deal with roles and permissions, so we just pass null. So we create an authentication object. Next, we call authentication.setDetails. And here as an argument, we pass a new instance of web authentication details source. Now, don't worry about memorizing this. This is just some boilerplate code you have to write only once. We create an instance of this class and then call build details and then pass the request. With this line, we're attaching some additional metadata about the request, like IP address and other stuff, to the authentication object. So we call setDetails. Next, we should call security context holder that get context and pass this authentication object. Security context holder stores information about the currently authenticated user. So we store this authentication object in security context holder, and in the future, we can use that to get access to the current user. We'll do that in the next lesson. Now, finally, we should pass control to the next filter in the filter chain. So once again, we call filter chain.doFilter. All right, our filter is ready. Now we want to make sure that this is the first filter in the chain, because filters have an order, and the order of this filter matters. It has to be called as early as possible. To do that, we go to our security config class. After we call authorize HTTP requests, we should add the filter. Here we have a few different methods for adding filters. We can add it before an existing filter or after it. We're going to add our new filter before a built-in filter in Spring Security. Now here as the first argument, we should pass our filter. So we should add a field to this class, a field of type JWT authentication filter. Now we pass this as the first argument. And as the second argument, we pass username, password, authentication, filter, class. This is the first filter in the chain, so we want to add our custom filter before this to ensure that it's called as early as possible. Now, to test our new filter, we want to make the validate endpoint protected. So let's remove this line and restart the application. Now, if we hit this endpoint with a valid token in the authorization header, we get a 200 response rate. If we pass an invalid token, then we get 403 error. Great. If we remove the authorization header, again, we get a 403 error. And also, if we set the authorization header to an empty string, we get a 403 error. So now the only way to access this endpoint is by passing a valid token in the authorization header.